Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Sams. I'm the preacher for the Judson Road Church of Christ in Longview, Texas, and I'm joined today by my good friend Shawn Chancellor. Shawn, good to see you.
How's it going, Tyler?
Man, it's going good. I am ready to get this knocked out. We have spent way more time than we ever imagined trying to get this worked out and posted.
Yeah, and one day we'll understand how it started working.
And maybe we'll be able to share it with others.
Got it.
Shawn and I are here reviewing nights 3 and 4 of the Reeves-Neubauer discussion on the AD 70 doctrine. Shawn, you have the proposition in front of you, don't you?
I do. The scriptures teach that Jesus of Nazareth returned for the second and final time in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
And in the affirmative, these last two nights was Holger Neubauer. In the negative was Bruce Reeves. And again, this debate was conducted at the church building of the Olson Park Church of Christ. They're in Amarillo, Texas. They have some upload limits with their Vimeo account, but in the next few weeks, the entirety of the debate should be uploaded there to Vimeo. But until then, you're able to access the videos of the debate on the Olson Park Church of Christ Facebook page.
Correct.
All right.
And stop.
So, Shawn, I thought what we might do in this review video, I'll look at Mr. Neubauer's affirmative arguments if you would review Mr. Reeves' negative argument. Sound good to you?
Sounds good to me.
All right. So let's look at what Mr. Neubauer had to say. He, again, was in the affirmative on both of these evenings, affirming the idea, as Shawn read earlier, that Jesus of Nazareth returned for the second and final time in the destruction of Jerusalem at AD 70. There were 3 or 4 primary arguments that Mr. Neubauer made, and in particular, one argument that kind of spanned over the course of both evenings and even reached a little bit back into Tuesday evening. And that was Zechariah, the Old Testament prophet Zechariah, in his book, repeatedly uses the phrase "in that day." That becomes a very significant phrase in the book of Zechariah. And Mr. Neubauer argued that in that day in Zechariah was a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. And so whenever we read "in that day" in the book of Zechariah, we are to read it with the understanding of the destruction of Jerusalem in context. And so that was the primary argument that he made throughout the week. We're not going to take a lot of time today to break down that argument. We're going to reserve that for future studies, but we are simply going to note that was his primary argument. And if Mr. Reeves was going to do his job in the negative, he needed to respond to that argument.
Yeah, that was very important, both to point out that was the affirmative argument, also the idea that Mr. Reeves had to respond to that.
That is the job of the negative speaker, is to respond in some way, shape, or form to the specific arguments made by the affirmative speaker. The second primary line of argumentation that Mr. Neubauer engaged in was kind of this A equals B, B equals C, then A equals C argument. And that was the second coming of Jesus, Mr. Neubauer affirmed, is miraculous in Mr. Reeves' paradigm, that the second coming of Jesus is miraculous. But both Mr. Neubauer and Mr. Reeves agree that the age of miraculous spiritual gifts has ended. Mm-hmm. And so if the age of miraculous spiritual gifts has ended, Mr. Neubauer's argument was, how can we still be awaiting, in your reckoning of things, another miracle to take place if you say that miracles have already ended? And so that was another argument that Mr. Reeves needed to respond to. The third argument that Mr. Neubauer put forward in his affirmative was the idea that it was just wholly unthinkable that an at-hand statement in Scripture, where you see a prophet using the phrase at hand, it's preposterous to think that an at-hand statement could reference an event thousands of years down the road. In particular, Mr. Neubauer said this, quote, "At hand always has one application, a particular generation," end quote. And then went on to say, quote, "A generation means 40 years," end quote. So at hand always has one application, a particular generation. A generation always means 40 years. And so at hand must reference that 40-year time period. And Shawn, this is something that you and I caught one of the hallmarks of Mr. Neubauer's reasoning is that you have to have the same definition for these words in any context in which they appear.
Yeah, and that seemed to get him in trouble throughout the week. This inability to realize that a different context, a phrase might have a different nuance in a different context. He kind of lays these rules out, and then he's kind of stuck living with them.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of gets him in trouble every now and then.
And I don't think we ever got, at least to my mind, I don't think we ever got a sufficient explanation as to why these definitions had to be locked in every context across Scripture.
And the burden of proof, if you're going to do that, is extremely high, because you have to prove that in whatever prophecy you're picking to make your definition, that's actually what the prophecy said.
Yep.
And then you have to prove your rule that supersedes context.
Instance.
And that's a problem. I mean, there were a couple of times that you and I just sitting there would pull our phones out and run a concordance search, and it didn't take long to find passages where his rule, I don't know how to apply it in those particular passages.
I think the one that sprang to both of our minds immediately was when Mr. Neubauer made the claim that clouds always mean that God's presence is hidden or obstructed. And it doesn't take you too long to pull up a search of the word cloud in Scripture and to find some instances where a cloud has absolutely no reference whatsoever to God in a normal reading of the passage.
Sometimes a cloud is, just a cloud.
Just a cloud, right. And then we had one final argument from Mr. Neubauer. And I don't necessarily know I would call this an argument, but it is a statement that he made repeatedly and wanted us as the audience to understand. He said, quote, "I believe the entire narrative of the Bible speaks about a time of the end, but no end of time. I believe that the concept of an end of time is unscriptural," end quote. And a few moments later, he would say this, and said this repeatedly throughout the debate, quote, "The time of the end is not the end of time," end quote. When he's talking about the time of the end there, Shawn, was it your understanding, like me, that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem?
It sure seemed that he was talking about AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, and that he was trying to funnel everything into that single moment in time.
And that became necessary for Mr. Neubauer because of how he defines these terms. And these terms have to be defined first and foremost in their Old Testament context. And when you first see that word appear, how it appears there in that context is how it must be used, according to Mr. Neubauer, how it must be used in all instances going forward. His quote from, was it Monday or Tuesday night? "A New Testament writer has no right to quote an Old Testament writer out of context."
Which is true.
Which is true. I think the burden of proof, though, is to demonstrate that they would be doing just that.
Yeah. Well, and the way he used that phrase was to really limit the Holy Spirit's use of his own words.
Right.
He couldn't have a secondary application. He couldn't broaden the concept or give us more information. He's, according to Mr. Neubauer, limited to what was said and to be honest, to Mr. Neubauer's understanding of what was said in a particular Old Testament passage.
And so those really were the primary arguments that Mr. Neubauer put forward both on Thursday and Friday night. And so Mr. Reeves, if he was to do his job, needed to respond to these arguments. So Shawn, as you look at the argumentation put forward by Mr. Reeves, did he answer these arguments?
Well, he certainly gave it his best. I would argue he answered them, but he certainly followed. And we might point out, when you're in the negative, there's a couple of ways that you can follow. You may go to the very verse that your opponent used, and you may show why that verse, in your opinion, does not say what your opponent said it says. Or you might just take the argument, and you might treat the argument more broadly, where you might go to other passages and show, well, these passages negate what he's saying, therefore they have to negate his perspective or view on the passages that he used. And I think Mr. Reeves really employed both of those methods. He went right through Zechariah. He followed the trail that Neubauer had left, and showing that Zechariah's phrase "in that day" cannot be a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. because of the things that Zechariah talks about happening in that day. They just don't fit. And I thought most telling was when he went to Zechariah 14 in verse 2, which was the primary verse in Zechariah 14 that Mr. Neubauer kept appealing to.
Yes.
That was where he wanted to go. And I had not caught this for whatever reason. But Mr. Reeves stood up and asked us if we'd noticed that Mr. Neubauer never read the rest of the verse. He didn't finish the verse. And the last phrase of Zechariah 14 verse 2 says, the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Well, if that's the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, what city are we talking about?
Yeah.
So it really dealt a blow to what Mr. Neubauer was saying in Zechariah 14. And then, Mr. Reeves said, let's read the next verse, which I've always been taught to do in Bible study.
Yes.
So we read verse 3 to us, and we found out that it speaks of the Lord going forth to fight against those nations. And that certainly is not something that happened in AD 7.
Not at all.
Which led to the question, is this talking about physical Israel or spiritual Israel? I think we're going to talk about that more some in a later video. But certainly, just those two phrases, at least in Zechariah chapter 14, would seem to indicate that this could not be AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, that there had to be something else in view. And then Mr. Reeves took us to 2 Peter chapter 3.
Yeah.
And he showed us that this describes the destruction of the universe. Mr. Neubauer kept using that phrase of his to say there was no such thing. But we went to 2 Peter chapter 3, and as we saw with 1 Corinthians 15, Mr. Reeves kind of took us through the whole chapter. Much shorter chapter this time, but he kind of took us through the whole chapter. He noticed that the scoffers were not making fun of the end of the Jewish era, that it would seem they were making fun of the cessation of the physical universe. And then he noticed, and to me this was pretty powerful, that Peter uses some examples before he talks about the destruction of the heaven and the earth. And those examples are the creation of the universe and the Genesis 6 flood. And he said, listen, these are universal material events. When God created the heavens and the earth, he created the physical universe that we see. And it was obviously a universal event. Same thing with the flood. It was real water on a real planet, and it was universal. It wasn't just universal in its impact. Rather, the whole planet was covered in water. So if you're going to use those two things as proofs or illustrations, demonstrations of this doctrine of the end of the world, then it has to be just that. It has to be a material universe under consideration, and it has to be, a universal impact, not just some cataclysmic event in one place. So when you read it that way, it becomes fairly apparent, I think, that there's no way Peter's talking about the destruction of the Jewish order, which was the argument that Mr. Neubauer made about the elemental things or the elements.
From chapter 3 and verse 12.
That was kind of the ABCs of the Jewish law. It just doesn't work. If that's the case, you would have had to have Peter using examples about circumcision maybe, or the priesthood maybe, something like that. Something like you'd see in the book of Hebrews. Yeah. Which is talking about the passing of the Jewish law, or the Jewish order. That's not what Peter does. It's nothing like that. So I thought very powerfully refuted that idea that the Bible spoke about, a time of the end, but not the end of time. And then Mr. Reeves argued that there is a substantial difference between spiritual gifts exercised by men and God's direct action. So Mr. Neubauer was arguing that since spiritual gifts have ceased, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that there's no miracle to come. Resurrection's clearly miraculous. I don't think anybody would deny that. But if miracles have ceased, then there can't be a resurrection as a result. And what he failed to notice is that 1 Corinthians chapter 13 deals with the gifts that God gave to men. And there's a little bit of a difference in saying that men can no longer perform miracles and in saying God can no longer act, outside of the natural order. Especially, and I think this is a point worth pointing out, that we're not talking about the, kind of charismatic Pentecostal idea of expect a miracle. We're not looking for God to just be performing miracles all the time. No one's arguing for that. But God promised this one. So if God said that there's going to be a day when I return and I'm going to call the dead from the graves, and then I'm going to destroy the world, is that miraculous? You betcha. but he said he was going to do it. And so we have reason to expect that, whereas we might not have reason to expect some of the other things that people would want us to see today as miraculous. And so I felt like that really answered, certainly followed Mr. Neubauer's line of argumentation. It seemed to be a powerful answer to it.
And I think, Shawn, that was something you and I both took away from Thursday and Friday night is we had a much more A to A, B to B style debate. And by that I mean you had an affirmative argument that was made, and you had a response that was given that was tailored specifically to that argument. We even had Mr. Neubauer at one point, was it on Friday night, kind of chide Mr. Reeves because Mr. Neubauer accused him of not really following him in argumentation. And I think at that moment, you heard kind of some air blown out by the audience because the audience realized that certainly didn't happen on Monday and Tuesday evening.
No, I don't think anybody that was listening believed that Mr. Neubauer made much of an attempt to follow Mr. Reeves Monday and Tuesday, especially in his 1 Corinthians 15 argumentation. He simply went to Hosea 6 and argued that from Hosea 6 that somehow the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, 1 Corinthians 15 had to be a spiritual resurrection. And he mentioned a couple other verses in 1 Corinthians 15, but that's about all he answered. After basically 3 speeches that were out of 1 Corinthians 15. It's kind of interesting. You and I had a little different seat than the rest of the audience. We were able to participate in a lot of the preparation that Mr. Reeves underwent. And we know just how much concern he had about making sure that he followed. And then when, I think that was Mr. Neubauer's first speech Friday, where he really challenged Mr. Reeves to follow him. And we went straight to Zechariah 14 and we went right through those verses and we read things that Mr. Neubauer had not read. So certainly Mr. Reeves followed him in that sense.
And what you said there, we read some things that Mr. Neubauer had not read. When you go back and you listen to this debate, either just as an audio file, if you watch it electronically, or if you listen to it as a podcast, read it as a book, whatever. Notice as Mr. Neubauer is in the book of Zechariah, notice if we ever read 3 passages in a row in the book of Zechariah. We're going to jump to verse 2, to verse 4, back to the previous chapter and verse 6, forward maybe 2 chapters. Mr. Neubauer never read multiple verses in their context, 1, 2, 3. And I think that was problematic. That was problematic to me in trying to follow the argument and in trying to buy into the argument.
Yeah, if nothing else, I think it limited his ability to persuade. Something I noticed was that he would read most of a verse and then he would finish it out with his inserted phrase.
Right.
The day of the end or 80, 70 or something along those lines. And I think you'll notice that. And I know for me, if you're wanting to convince me that there's no bodily resurrection, that the universe is just going to continue on forever, that all the promises of the Bible were fulfilled in AD 70, you're gonna have to really get into a context and show me why you're saying what you're saying. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, Mr. Neubauer did not seem to do that.
No.
Probably the most glaring thing that you saw in the debate was the difference in the approach to Bible study between Mr. Reeves and Mr. Neubauer. Whereas we go through 58 verses, setting a context both within the chapter of 1 Corinthians, with a little bit of discussion about the cultural background of the church there, and then noticing how that statement and those statements connected to other passages in the New Testament. And then Mr. Neubauer's approach of, and I agree with you, and I'm not trying to put the man down.
No, not at all.
But he did. As a matter of fact, when he was challenged on Hosea 6, the challenge was get up here and read the rest of the chapter. We never heard the rest of that chapter, and that was very telling to me. If I was on the brink, or I was there to figure out which position did I agree with, it would have been hard to persuade me with that approach.
I believe the statement is we heard turkey boo about it. But and Shawn, let's I think everyone who is watching this realizes this. Shawn, you and I both came into this debate pretty well on our views pretty well lined up with those that were being espoused by Mr. Reeves.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't think we've tried to be covert about that or anything, but we have tried to give a fair hearing to both sides. And I think, Shawn, that's something that disappointed both of us, that we were wanting to hear a deeper textual examination and deeper answers from Mr. Neubauer so that we could better understand the doctrine he was espousing. I mean, I want to be able to understand. I'm open to the idea that I might be wrong about something, and I'm willing to change if it can be demonstrated to me from Scripture that I am wrong. I had an open mind. I'm willing to study. But I don't feel like there was a lot of study that was being put forward from Mr. Not that he's not personally studious, he evidently is. But there wasn't a lot of deep contextual connection that was being brought out by Mr. Neubauer in this debate.
I wonder if that's a trait of this doctrine, if it's a fair way to put it that way. This is the second time I've gone to a debate on this issue. And I'll be honest with you, I think Mr. Neubauer came closer to doing what you're talking about than the other debater I heard. But it was kind of the same thing, to the point, in the first debate I heard, it was kind of hard to figure out what the man believed.
Yeah.
Now, I think Mr. Reeves did a good job with his questions and with some of the statements he brought up in making sure that Mr. Neubauer had to tell us what he believed. Not that I'm suggesting he wouldn't have wanted to.
Sure.
But yeah, it was a little more confusing to try to follow. A lot, there wasn't much effort put into connecting passages or to show us why the context the passages were in, the verses, I should say, were in, really fit what Mr. Neubauer was suggesting or saying.
Now, I think especially if you watch the video presentation of this debate, that becomes even clearer when you look at the visuals that were presented by either speaker. But Shawn, you mentioned questions there. I think that's something we ought to talk about very, very briefly here. If you're going to watch the video recording of this debate, you're going to notice 2 or 3 times in the debate that the presentation stops for a few moments, and it looks like either speaker is looking off somewhere off to the side and engaging in much more muted conversation. And Shawn, what was going on there, as you and I know, there were 3 points of order. I think it was 3 points of order that were called during the course of this debate. A point of order in debate is simply where one side or the other in the discussion stands up and says, I call a point of order, which is to say, I think there may have been some rule that we had pre-established in this discussion that has been violated. I want to bring that up and get to a resolution.
And there's a couple ideas there. It could be the agreement that was written between Mr. Neubauer and Mr. Reeves. Mm-hmm. Some people may not be aware of that. The debaters were communicating for a year. They had a written agreement, and it covered a lot.
Yeah.
And you signed that, so everybody knew that everybody knew. And the other thing could be the rules for honorable controversy. If one debater felt that the other violated that, which I don't think ever happened.
No.
But it's Hedges' rules of honorable controversy. If you're not familiar with those, you can Google it. If one debater felt the other one violated those, then of course there'd be a point of order. But nothing like that happened.
No. So let's talk about the first 2 points of order that were called. And they were called with respect to what you were mentioning earlier, Shawn, the questions. Mm-hmm. Mr. Reeves and Mr. Neubauer had an agreement before the debate began that 15 minutes prior to each evening's activities, 5 questions would be exchanged by each party. And so Mr. Reeves would receive 5 questions from Mr. Neubauer. Mr. Neubauer would receive 5 questions from Mr. Reeves. They'd have that 15-minute time frame to answer those questions privately. And then at the beginning of their first speech of the evening, they were to answer the 5 questions that had been submitted by their opponent. And Shawn, actually, I think you'll be able to insert into our video the text of the agreement that Mr. Reeves and Mr. Neubauer had. I think you've got that in your email inbox now. So twice a point of order was called. Both of these points of order were called by Kyle Pope, who was the moderator for Mr. Reeves. And the point of order was called no earlier than 15 minutes in to the first speech of Mr. Neubauer on 2 different evenings. The questions were supposed to be answered within, the statement was at the beginning of the first speech of the evening, but now you were more than halfway through the speeches, and the questions had not been read aloud and had not been answered, or at least in one case thought they had not been answered. And so twice a point of order was called with reference to that. To some degree, shape, or form, it all got sorted out, especially on Friday night when that happened. It was resolved rather quickly. Was it Tuesday night or Thursday night, Shawn, when we had the other one?
Well, there was one Tuesday night about whether or not the questions had been answered, and then there was one late Friday night, but it was about something different.
So that one on Tuesday night is the one you're going to have to go back yourself when you watch the debate and see. As the point of order was called, Mr. Pope said, Mr. Neubauer, the questions have not been answered yet. And Mr. Neubauer said, well, actually, I have answered them. And you're going to have to go back for yourself as an impartial audience member, watch that, and determine whether or not that actually took place. But even with that minor disagreement, Shawn, I think that was the biggest disagreement outside of the actual text of the debate that the debaters ever had.
Yeah, and now understand they were passionate. They pressed their points. They were very direct and forthright. You want that in a debate. You don't want people who kind of dodge around the issue. So there might be moments where it seems like it was getting a little more aggressive than maybe we're typically seeing in a pulpit. But everybody was gentlemanly. No one misbehaved in any way.
There were no fisticuffs or anything like that.
No name calling, no, nothing like that from either dispute.
The other point of order that was called near the end of Mr. Reeves' final speech on Friday evening. Mr. Reeves was dealing with 2 Peter 3, Shawn, that you just talked about, and the concept of a universal flood, and Mr. Reeves made the point. Now, Mr. Neubauer, I know you believe in a universal flood, but the logical consequences of the doctrine seem to indicate that did not happen. And there are several in the preterist, the realized eschatology party, who have disavowed belief in a universal flood. And it was at that point that Mr. Bishel, who was the moderator for Mr. Neubauer, stood up and said, I call a point of order. He never said that. And Mr. Reeves responded, well, I know he didn't say that. I said he didn't say that. And what best you and I can figure out, Shawn, is Mr. Neubauer and Mr. Bishel, his moderator, had been talking, which is not something bad in the debate.
Yeah.
You talk to your table to make sure you heard something correctly, to make sure you're answering arguments. And it's quite possible, I think, that they just didn't hear Mr. Reeves when he said, Mr. Neubauer, I know you believe this, and so I'm not saying you said this, but this is a consequence with some of this teaching. And that point of order worked itself out almost as quickly as it was called.
Yeah, it was no big deal. Although Mr. Neubauer did ask, and I doubt you'll be able to hear this on the video, but he did ask that Mr. Reeves limit himself to things that Mr. Neubauer had said.
Yeah.
Which I found a little strange considering some of the things Mr. Neubauer had said throughout the week. He seemed to bring up a lot of what I would call bad ideas that we hear sometimes from brethren. And he acted as if Mr. Reeves believed those.
Right.
Which he never made an argument like that in the debate. He never claimed to believe these things in the debate. And I know Mr. Reeves, well, I know him well enough it's awkward to call him Mr. Reeves, I'll tell you that. But I know him well enough to know he didn't hold, I don't believe, any of those positions. But whatever. You know, he let that go. Mr. Neubauer didn't. But you're right. It worked itself out. It was a 30-second hiccup, and we moved on.
And Shawn, what you were talking about there, Mr. Neubauer kind of creating this monster that Mr. Reeves supposedly believed in when Mr. Reeves didn't. That has a name when you're talking about logic, right? That's called the straw man fallacy. And I think we saw a couple of straw men pop up in the course of this debate. One of them that we're going to talk about in a future episode about Hades. That Mr. Neubauer had this awful construction of Mr. Reeves preaching people into Hades, which in this construct is a place you would go after you die, but you're separated from God, and you're kind of I think you described it the other day in the waiting room, right? You're a patient waiting on the doctor, but you're not in there.
In one of our failed attempts to produce this video, yeah, I think I did. Yeah, and you know,
ahead,
that's
please.
interesting to me because number one, I don't know how you preach anyone into anywhere. He was talking about funerals, and I'm not sure exactly what that means. But I did find it interesting. Mr. Reeves never said any such thing about Hades.
Yeah.
And I found it interesting. Mr. Neubauer never asked Mr. Reeves, to my knowledge, that I remember, what his position was on Hades. He just seemed to kind of assume that it was this one idea. Whereas later in the week, when Mr. Reeves was able to respond to that, what he described was something very different. Something where when you died, you go to be with God. You're waiting on your resurrection body, but you go to be with God. Of course, like I said, we're going to talk about that more in another episode. But yeah, it was interesting to see him kind of charge Bruce with that one idea and then tear it apart, only to find out that wasn't Mr. Reeves' concept of Hades.
And then we had another straw man, this was especially apparent on Monday and Tuesday, the straw man of corruption. Mr. Neubauer, especially on Monday and Tuesday, stood up in front of the audience, held his arms out. I don't want to say he acted like he had the wounds of Jesus, because that carries with it.
Yeah, no, it
sounds uncomfortable. But talking about the wounds of Jesus that would have been, according to Mr. Reeves, in the resurrection body of Jesus, and how if Jesus' resurrection body bore those wounds, that was an indication that Jesus was corrupted and not incorruptible. And I think that took quite a few people aback.
Yeah, it was the way that he said it. Obviously, he does not think that Jesus' physical resurrection happened the way that Mr. Reeves thought so. But it was just the kind of mocking tone he took.
Yeah.
The way he spoke of Jesus in that moment was a little shocking. It was also strange to me that what he thought Peter and Thomas, and then of course Paul in Acts 9 saw, was apparently a wounded Jesus, a Jesus that was in the throes of the pain that he would have felt on the cross. At least that's the way I took what he was saying. And I don't know anybody that believes that. When we see the marks of his crucifixion, the proof of his sacrifice for sin, I think so.
The gospel writers seem to indicate that.
Yeah, it sure seems that way. 1 Corinthians 15, whatever Peter saw is what Paul witnessed. I don't have a problem with that, but I don't think that's a wounded Jesus. That's the picture of the Lamb in Revelation.
There was almost the implication, and let me make clear, Mr. Neubauer did not say this, but there was almost the implication from where I was sitting that those wounds would have been something, that those wounds would have been problematic or something to be ashamed of in a resurrected body.
That was my perception too. And I don't understand that. What shame is there in being the salvation of the world and of having marks that demonstrate that? I really don't know. But that was certainly my understanding.
And again, as you mentioned, it lines up well with the picture of the slain but risen Lamb there in the book of Revelation. Well, Shawn, let's wrap this up by, let's make sure again that we're fair with both speakers.
Sure.
As you look at what Mr. Neubauer presented in the final examination of things, Mr. Neubauer put forth to the audience that the New Testament must be read through the prism of the Old Testament. That the Old Testament sets the context and the understanding for many of these New Testament terms, and what we read and understand in the Old Testament is what we must read and understand when we come across those terms in the New Testament. End, words like that become defined in the Old Testament according to Mr. Neubauer, and then understood in their Old Testament meanings in the New Testament. Mr. Neubauer affirmed there will be no moment of dissolution of the earth, its works, and its inhabitants, right? That the earth will keep on going until, I don't know if it will go on forever, if it will go on till some inevitable heat death of the universe or something like that. But according to Mr. Neubauer, there is no moment of dissolution of the earth, the works in it, because as Mr. Neubauer looks at 2 Peter chapter 3, he says 2 Peter chapter 3 is written prior to AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. And so therefore 2 Peter chapter 3 looks forward not to a bodily return of Christ in which the dead are raised incorruptible and the world is judged and destroyed, but rather 2 Peter 3 looks forward to the destruction of Jerusalem. And of course, his argument you mentioned earlier from 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 12 on the word elements there, and how that's used in Galatians and Hebrews and Colossians and associated with Judaism. Mr. Neubauer as well affirmed that 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of a spiritual resurrection, which by spiritual resurrection he means the opening and the emptying of Hades, where the Old Testament saints were, where Jesus had gone. Now it's opened and emptied, and that's a spiritual resurrection. And it was a bodily resurrection in the sense that it was the body of believers, a corporate body of Old Testament saints that was delivered from Hades. In the sense that Mr. Reeves presented it, Mr. Neubauer said there is no future bodily resurrection. However, Mr. Neubauer would affirm, and this is what made the debate so confusing, especially the first two nights, both speakers said, I believe in a bodily resurrection. But you have to define that term bodily, and you have to define that term resurrection. And Mr. Neubauer would say, I do not believe in a future bodily individual body resurrection that is coming up out of the ground, changed into immortality and incorruptibility and off to eternity.
One word I don't remember him defining from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You know, and just use that corporate concept or that corporate idea there, which it created some confusion, especially Monday and Tuesday before Mr. Reeves had an opportunity to kind of point out the difference in what they were saying.
Which is why, if you'll remember in our first two videos, you and I really harped on the idea of there are some terms that need to be defined in this discussion. And I think as we got to Thursday and Friday, it became really, really apparent why we needed those terms to be defined.
And that's so important anytime you're talking to someone who differs with you, but especially in a doctrine like AD 70, where you are taking a very different view, not just of a concept, but of an event. And you're going to use the same terminology to talk about that event, even though you're talking about it in two extremely different ways.
Yes.
Or maybe you're even talking about two different events, I guess you could say, using the same term.
Yeah.
And you don't define those terms, confusion is going to occur.
Yeah. So, Shawn, tell me, as you look at kind of the overall body of what Mr. Reeves presented, how would you describe it?
Well, Mr. Reeves told us that the Old Testament must be read through the prism of the New Testament, that we can learn what the Old Testament authors meant sometimes, and sometimes take what they were saying and put it in a broader context, or at least the New Testament authors do. Maybe they even use it as a secondary application. Maybe there's an allusion, not a direct quotation, but that the New Testament reveals things that were still concealed under the old law. He told us that there will be a moment of dissolution of the earth where the universe is going to be destroyed. It will cease to exist. And of course, we talked about that in 2 Peter chapter 3, which he argued looks forward to the destruction of the earth and its works, which will occur when Christ returns, not figuratively or spiritually or representatively, but visibly, physically, in reality. He's going to come back personally. And we talked a little bit about the word parousia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we did.
In that vein. He also told us that 1 Corinthians 15 speaks of a bodily resurrection. Again, not the same way that Mr. Neubauer is using that word, but rather that individuals would come back from the grave, that we will not remain in that state where our body and spirit are separated, but they would be reunited, the righteous to go to eternal life, the wicked to go to eternal punishment, and that was going to be accomplished at that visible, audible, bodily return of Christ, which is vouched for by his own death, burial, and resurrection, The idea being there that the fact that Jesus came forth from the grave stands as testimony that men will come forth from the grave.
Yep.
We spent a lot of time in 1 Corinthians 15.
A lot of time in 1 Corinthians 15.
And so we should be looking forward to a future bodily resurrection. Again, death reversal on the individual level. Those that are righteous, of course, that will be followed by an eternity with God. Now, we want to point out it's that which is sown is that which is raised, but there's a change. Mm-hmm. So the corruptible is raised incorruptible, the weak is raised powerful, so forth and so on. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, we will be changed. So we're not suggesting, Mr. Reeves was not suggesting that this body that is so frail is going to continue to be this frail body.
Correct.
But that there will be some substantial change that takes place, but we're still going to be us.
Yep.
And so exactly how that works out, exactly what that means, well, I hope to find out one day. That's as we might say, God's end of the stick. But that's certainly what Mr. Reeves argued 1 Corinthians 15 and a host of other passages teach.
So again, Shawn and I would simply encourage you. We don't expect you. We don't want you to just take our words for it. Go and watch this debate, listen to this debate, read this debate, consume it in whatever way you can, and lay down what you hear, what you read, what you see beside the scriptures, and let the scriptures be your ultimate guide.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to, in the coming weeks, have another 2 or 3 studies with you where we talk maybe some about Hades, some about the book of Zechariah, and maybe another topic or 2 here and there. But
and
we'll
if this
say
actually
that for the
worked
future.
today, and we've got this technology figured out, it won't be nearly as difficult in the future. So
you guys do not know how many wasted hours of film that we have.
I'm just glad it's not film. That would have got expensive.
That would have. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward, hopefully, to being back with you in the future. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.